When the United States entered World War I on the Western Front, the battlefield there was already operating under the logic of trench warfare. France had dedicated machine gun units, Britain did as well, and that made one thing clear. To fight here, the United States could not take a different path. By the time American forces began operating on the Western Front, the battlefield had already been governed by the logic of trench warfare since the early years of the war. The problem was that the U.S. Army had not been built for this kind of fighting. It lacked a doctrine for static, sustained firepower, while the entire front was dominated by the ability to maintain fire over long periods of time. At this stage, the U.S. Army had no real alternative but to directly absorb combat experience from Britain and France, forces that had already shaped their methods around trench warfare and organized their tactics around machine gun fire. In trench warfare, advancing did not mean expanding territory. It meant seizing points of control, a section of line that allowed observation, a position for a machine gun, a strip of ground that denied the enemy the ability to fire freely across the front. In this kind of battlefield, standing still was not safe defense. It meant accepting that artillery and enemy fire would slowly grind the position down over time. And for infantry to leave the trench along that axis, firepower did not need to be overwhelming, but it had to be sustained long enough to neutralize the space they were forced to cross. So for firepower to be sustained long enough under those conditions, it could not rely on a single weapon. It had to depend on an entire system of equipment built specifically for that purpose. Item 1. M1917 Browning Machine Gun. Infantry had to leave the trench to seize control points, but if firepower broke mid-movement, every step forward instantly became exposed to intersecting fire. The danger was not at the moment of assault, but at the point where infantry had already left cover and had not yet reached the objective. If fire stopped there, the formation had no way back. The M1917 made it possible to sustain continuous fire long enough to lock down the space infantry had to cross. It did not create a breakthrough. It prevented the axis of advance from collapsing halfway through. The M1917 was heavy, slow to move, and only valuable once fixed in position. It did not follow the infantry. The infantry maneuvered around it. A machine gun like the M1917 was not supporting infantry firepower. It was the point the entire tempo of the formation depended on. As long as the M1917 was firing, infantry could continue to move along the chosen axis. Without it, the formation lost the ability to sustain momentum. Item 2. Ammunition. Belted ammunition was carried so fire did not stop while infantry were crossing open ground. It allowed the gun to maintain pressure on the opposing line for the entire window needed to seize and hold a new position. Item 3. Spare barrel. A spare barrel was carried so the gun did not have to leave position simply because the active barrel exceeded its heat tolerance. Immediate replacement kept fire anchored at the same control point, instead of forcing the formation to pause or reposition the gun. Item 4. Cooling and heat management. Cooling systems were carried to control heat generated by sustained fire, rather than allowing temperature to dictate when firing had to stop. Heat-resistant gloves allowed direct handling of the gun when the receiver and barrel were too hot, enabling barrel changes or adjustments without waiting for natural cooling. The water jacket and condenser allowed cooling to continue during firing, so the rate of fire followed mission requirements, not momentary physical limits. Item 5. Observation and fire control. Observation tools were carried to identify targets beyond the gun's direct line of sight in trench environments broken by terrain and smoke. Binoculars allowed tracking of movement along the opposing line, while range estimation tools enabled indirect fire setup. They shifted firing from visual reflex to fire based on read and calculated space, matching the tempo of prolonged trench combat. Item 6. Gun maintenance kit. A maintenance kit was carried to address wear, fouling, and stoppages caused by sustained firing in mud, dirt, and artillery smoke. It allowed the gun team to keep the weapon operational across multiple firing cycles without pulling it from the fight to handle basic issues. Item 7. Fire control marking. Aiming stakes were used to fix firing direction and sector limits even when visibility was reduced by smoke, fog, or darkness. They allowed the team to re-establish the exact same fire lane across multiple engagements without direct visual confirmation of the target. Item 8. Navigation and positioning. Compasses and 1 to 10,000 fire maps were carried to precisely determine gun position and firing direction during phases where the target could not be seen directly. These maps allowed teams to pre-mark targets by grid reference, calculate bearing and distance, and conduct fire based on coordinates rather than visual observation in obscured terrain. Item 9. Entrenching tool. Entrenching tools were carried to build gun pits and basic cover, instead of placing the weapon directly on exposed ground. They allowed firing positions to be shaped to fire requirements, rather than relying on terrain by chance. Item 10. Load-bearing combat system. This system distributed ammunition and essential gear on the body so the gun team did not have to leave position for immediate resupply. It kept fire operational in a ready state, independent of rear baggage or delayed supply. Item 11. Carry mode. Backpacks were used to transport additional ammunition, accessories, and heavy items during movement phases before the gun was deployed. Item 12. M1903 Springfield. Rifles were carried to secure the gun team during moments when machine gun fire could not yet cover all sectors, especially during deployment, repositioning, or close-range contact. They allowed part of the team to handle threats outside the gun's axis, so the primary weapon did not have to break its task. Item 13. Sidearm M1911. Sidearms were carried for personal defense when distance collapsed rapidly and neither the machine gun nor rifle could respond in time. They allowed team leaders and operators to retain immediate reaction capability in confined space without releasing control of the gun. Item 14. Fragmentation grenade. Fragmentation grenades were carried to deal with blind spots that direct fire could not reach, shell holes, trench intersections, or obstacles directly in front of the position. They pushed threats out of close approach space so the machine gun could continue operating without direct pressure. Item 15. Smoke grenade. Smoke grenades were carried to obscure vision during state changes, withdrawing personnel, adjusting position, or handling gaps directly in front of the gun. They created temporary concealment long enough for required actions to be completed. Item 16. Uniform form. A heavy wool uniform served as the constant base layer, allowing soldiers to stand still, move short distances, and work for hours in the cold, wet environment of trench warfare. Wool retained warmth even when soaked with rain or mud, preventing weather from eroding physical capacity. Item 17. Headgear. Steel helmets were worn to reduce casualties from shell fragments and ricochets, the most common threat in trench and artillery environments. They existed to keep the gun team operational under continuous indirect fire. Item 18. Footwear. Trench boots were used to withstand mud, water, and constantly broken ground while soldiers stood for long periods and shifted position frequently. Puttees prevented mud and water from entering the boot and secured trouser legs to avoid snagging in trenches and obstacles. Item 19. Hydration. Canteens were carried to keep the body functional during long periods of immobility and sustained work. They prevented physical and cognitive degradation while the task was still ongoing. Item 20. Rations. Rations were carried so soldiers could continue working through extended periods of waiting and holding. They provided minimal sustainment, enough for the body to keep pace with the mission. Item 21. Medical. Individual dressings were carried to immediately treat basic wounds at the position. They allowed rapid self-aid so the formation could continue operating without disruption from minor injuries. Item 22. Weather, environmental protection. Weather protection was carried to keep the body dry and stable during prolonged exposure, when rain, wind, and cold accelerated fatigue. It allowed soldiers to remain ready to work in unfavorable conditions. Item 23. Signature reduction. Helmet nets were used to break the circular outline and reflective surface of steel helmets, reducing visibility while stationary in trenches or shallow positions. They allowed attachment of local camouflage material, helping the helmet blend into surrounding soil and terrain. Item 24. Closed utility tools. Closed utility tools were used to cut barbed wire, shape sandbags into firing apertures, and open ammunition crates, physical tasks essential to operating a heavy machine gun in trench warfare. Item 25. Gas mask. Gas masks were carried because artillery in World War I frequently employed chemical agents, making contaminated air a routine condition of defensive and counter-battery combat. They allowed the gun team to remain in position and continue operating when the environment became chemically hazardous, instead of abandoning the line due to air conditions alone. This loadout did not appear because the U.S. Army wanted another new unit. It took shape when the Western Front no longer allowed infantry to advance on willpower alone. In terrain locked down by trenches, the question was no longer who fired first, but who could keep fire in place longer. From what was learned from the British and the French, and from the limits the battlefield imposed, the U.S. Army reorganized its firepower into a unit built around sustained pressure. And that is how the machine gun company became a loadout not designed to move fast, but to make movement possible.